Welcome to This Explainer. Okay, so when we hear the word anarchism, most of us instantly picture chaos, right? Broken windows, protests, complete societal collapse. But what if I told you that's actually a massive misconception? At its core, this heavily misunderstood philosophy isn't about promoting violence at all. It's really about questioning the very foundation of authority itself. Today, we're going to demystify antinomianism, which is the ethical term for anarchism, by going straight to the source. We're looking directly at the foundational texts to see how these historical thinkers actually challenged the status quo and what they truly believed about human freedom. Okay, let's dive into this. Here's our thematic journey for today. We're starting with the anarchist misconception. Then we'll tackle the social contract myth, the ego and society, and revolution from below. After that, we'll look at the right to opt out. And finally, wrap the whole thing up with individual sovereignty and force. All right, Section 1, the anarchist misconception. So, antinomianism in ethics basically translates to anarchism in a socio-political context. It's the belief that the imposition of authority is just fundamentally illegitimate. In everyday interpersonal terms, it boils down to one simple, powerful declaration: you do not speak for me. The source material actually offers a brilliant analogy for this. Think about mandatory citizenship based on where you were born. It's kind of like being forced to use an old-school landline in a post-smartphone world. Through an anarchist lens, citizenship and societal participation should be totally voluntary. Like, it should be as easy as switching your cell phone provider. It's this core assertion that nobody inherently holds authority over you without your explicit, enthusiastic consent. Now, because the term anarchism is essentially just a rejection of the state, there is a massive amount of disagreement on what a positive alternative actually looks like. I mean, the black flag comes in a lot of different colors. On one side, you have left-wing anarchism, which advocates for a peaceful, cooperative society built on mutual aid and complete equality, with a strict opposition to any sort of domination. But then, on the flip side, you have right-wing anarchism. This is a capitalist ideology that views the government as inherently predatory and relies entirely on free markets instead. It's absolutely fascinating. Both sides completely reject the state, but as you can see, their visions for a free society are literally worlds apart. Moving right along to Section 2, the social contract myth. For this, we're starting with William Godwin, who's widely regarded as the first modern anarchist. Way back in his 1793 text, Inquiry Concerning Political Justice, Godwin completely dismantled the whole idea of an unwritten social contract. And honestly, if you stop and think about it for a second, the concept of a social contract sounds totally deranged if you were explaining it to an adult for the very first time. It basically assumes you consented to this massive, incredibly complex system of rules that you were simply born into, without you ever signing a single piece of paper or agreeing to any of the specific terms. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how Godwin relentlessly attacks the whole logic of tacit consent. He asks these brilliant questions that we almost never think to ask ourselves. Who are the actual parties to this contract? For how long is it binding? If consent is supposedly necessary, how exactly is it given? I mean, if you're bound by laws that were written decades before you were even born, is your obligation based on a contract your grandfather signed? Godwin basically points out that handing someone 50 volumes of dense legal code and claiming they tacitly agreed to them just by existing in a certain geographic location, well, it's logically absurd. Godwin captured this idea perfectly. He wrote, "Acquiescence is frequently nothing more than a choice on the part of the individual of what he deems the least evil." He's making the argument that just because you live quietly under a set of laws, it definitely doesn't mean you agreed to them. Your everyday compliance, paying your taxes, renewing your driver's license, that isn't enthusiastic consent. It's just you choosing the path of least resistance. Let's be real, most of us don't have the wealth or resources to just up and move to another country. So you're just choosing the least evil option available, which is staying out of prison. Let's transition to Section 3, the ego and society. Meet Max Stirner. This guy was a highly energetic, very idiosyncratic thinker from the 1840s. In his famous book, The Ego and His Own, Stirner championed something called radical egoism. He argued that all those purportedly morally binding concepts we hear about, duty, society, the sacred laws of the state, he called them mere spooks, literally just ghosts haunting our minds. He believed that the unbridled ego, the true individual, is the state's ultimate enemy. His writings sparked this proud, unapologetic rebellion against any sacred law that tries to force the individual to submit to the collective. And this brilliantly illustrates Stirner's highly controversial view on rights. He didn't believe rights were some magical gift handed down by society, the government, or even nature. Actually, scratch that. He thought your rights derive purely from your own power and your own might. If the state or society grants you a right, Stirner just calls that a foreign right because it's not truly yours. For Stirner, the individual is the one and only creator of their rights. It's decided purely by your own will and your actual physical or mental power to enact them. If it is right for me, it is right. All right, Section 4, Revolution from Below. Now we turn to Pierre-Joseph Proudhon, writing right around 1850. Proudhon holds this immense historical significance because he was actually the very first intellectual to proudly adopt the anarchist label. He's the one who famously coined the phrase, property is theft, and he advocated for an entirely different system known as mutualism. He envisioned this world where everyone works voluntarily, totally for the benefit of all, but crucially, this was very distinct from state-run socialism. He wanted a society where people organize themselves organically, from the ground up, completely without some authoritarian overseer pulling the strings.
Proudhon made this fascinating argument that governments, just by their very nature, cannot be revolutionary. Think about it. A political revolution, like overthrowing a king just to install a parliament, that merely transfers authority from an old master to a new one. But a true social revolution, that abolishes authority among men entirely. Proudhon believed there's no way you can use the state apparatus to create liberty, because the state's entire existence relies on having the authority to discipline people. So true progress has to be spontaneous. It has to be driven by the people from below, not dictated by a government from above.
Moving into Section 5, the right to opt out. Let's move to our next thinker and see how this builds, because this ideology was pushed even further by Herbert Spencer. In his 1851 work Social Statics, this preeminent British intellectual argued something incredibly radical for the time. He said that individuals have the absolute right to voluntarily drop their connection with the state. If the state is basically just a mutual safety confederation, like a security agent we hired to protect us, then logically, an individual should be perfectly free to say, "No thanks, I don't want your services, and I won't pay your taxes." By ignoring the state, you're embracing what he called voluntary outlawry. Yes, you lose its protection, but you retain your absolute, uncompromised freedom. Spencer wrote, "The rule of the many by the few we call tyranny. The rule of the few by the many is tyranny also, only of a less intense kind." He completely rejected the idea that majorities are somehow omnipotent. I mean, just because 51% of people vote to rob, restrict, or control the other 49% doesn't magically make it morally right. Coercion, even when it's democratic coercion, is never truly equitable in Spencer's eyes. Sure, the democratic form of government might be the least objectionable because it theoretically trespasses against the smallest number of people, but at its core, it is still fundamentally an infringement on individual liberty. And that brings us to Section 6, Individual Sovereignty and Force. Let's talk about Josiah Warren. He was a utopian thinker and the founder of the modern times experimental community out on Long Island, where he famously advocated that cost is the limit of price. He wrote a text called True Civilization in 1863. Now, keep in mind, this was right in the middle of the horrific bloodshed of the American Civil War. While the whole nation was tearing itself apart, brothers slaughtering brother over state authority and control, Warren was out there denouncing that very same authority. He firmly believed in complete self-sovereignty, the idea that every single individual has an inalienable right to control their own person, their own time, and their own property. But Warren wasn't a total pacifist. He definitely recognized the real-world need to deal with violent encroachments. He actually detailed a really fascinating escalation analogy to show how this philosophy perfectly allows for self-defense. For example, if a house is on fire, grabbing a passerby's pail of water without asking is a nonviolent intervention that pretty much anyone would excuse. If an uninvited person enters your home, you'd escalate to a verbal request for them to leave. But coercive force, like calling in an army or the police, that is only justified to stop an active wanton robbery or a physical attack. Basically, the only legitimate use of force is to prevent or repair unnecessary violence. So the crucial point is captured perfectly in this quote from Warren. The legitimate and appropriate mission of governments is the defense and protection of the inalienable right of sovereignty in every individual within his or her own sphere. For Warren, if a government is going to exist at all, its sole, fundamental function must be intervention purely for the sake of non-intervention. It should only ever act to protect the sovereign individual from violent encroachment, and it must absolutely never become the aggressor itself. Which brings us to our final provocative thought for this explainer. If the will of the majority cannot justify murder or theft, and if the state's true mission is only supposed to be preventing violence, then what actually justifies the arbitrary violence of the state itself? Think about it. Whether it's the enforcement of taxes, throwing people in cages for victimless crimes, or waging massive foreign wars, how does the state legitimize actions that would be considered 100% criminal if done by you or me? I really want you to take these historical perspectives and apply them to your own life and the laws you live under today. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer. Keep questioning, keep learning, and I will see you next time.